Now we're realizing, and as they did as well,
Right.
that it's a spiritual malady and that it is something much deeper and that it really is a response to pain. And so with conscious recovery, I identify the 3 root causes of addiction as unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame.
Welcome to Peggy's Recovery Corner. This is a recovery podcast where we talk about all things recovery. Recovery from what? Recovery from addiction, from alcoholism, from mental health, and maybe recovery from many other things that maybe one day we'll get guests on that are outside the box. But before we get started, please, if you're on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. Please share it. Please like it. And now we're going to get into who my guest is today. This is TJ Woodward. He has been on the show before. I always like to interact with him. Just a good man. I've been to some conferences and heard him speak. He's in recovery. Welcome to the corner.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here
Good to
in
have you
person
back.
this time.
In
I love it.
Definitely. So before we get into everything that you do in the world, because you do so many different things, I want to hear about TJ growing up, who you were, where were you born, where were you raised, and then we can get into the nitty gritty, and then we can get into the recovery aspect.
Well, perfect, because I do like to actually go back to the beginning.
Okay.
I was born in a place as strange as Indiana.
Okay.
In a time long, long ago. I do actually like to kind of start with the childhood stuff because I actually remember being really young and being very, very happy, just absolutely filled with joy, connection, awe, wonder, like feeling like the luckiest kid alive. And that definitely did not last for me. I remember actually, like it was yesterday, a profound experience around age 7 of my heart closing. Grew up in a family that looked really good on the outside, but there was a lot going on under the surface and a lot, what people were saying, what people were doing, and the energy I felt were 3 totally different things. And through a series of events called Life on Planet Earth, I closed my heart at age 7 and made some huge decisions that stuck with me for many, many years.
Now, closing your heart at 7, was there siblings or anything like that you were growing up around, or was it just were you an only child?
1 older sister, 1 younger sister.
Okay. And do you want to disclose why you closed your heart?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, looking really good on the outside was such a theme. But my dad had some addictions that I remember when I first got into recovery, I said, I don't come from an addicted home because the addictions weren't drugs or alcohol or things that were really obvious. But let's just say my dad and his brothers, to say were hypersexual would be an understatement.
Okay.
My mom was a stay-at-home mom and but definitely undiagnosed mental health issues.
Okay.
It was a different era. So she vacillated between rage or depression.
Oh.
So I actually really relate to hearing people say, going home and not knowing which mom is going to be on the other side of the door.
Oh.
So even though it wasn't classic addiction, there were definitely very similar experiences.
Okay. Okay. So when you closed yourself off, like what were you like just a silent kid? Were you isolating?
I really was. Like at that point, I went from being this effervescent, outgoing, very happy kid to really going within. And it felt like it was something outside of me, putting a wall around my heart. I don't really know exactly, what happened in those dark years, if you will, from 7 to 14. But I do remember feeling very disconnected and unplugged and shut down. At age 14, I discovered weed and alcohol. So that brought me back out of that.
So did you kind of block out everything from 7 to 14?
I wouldn't say I blocked everything out, but I just remember it feeling kind of like swimming in oatmeal. That's the best thing I can the best way I can describe it. I just remember feeling really lost and having these massive life decisions. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. I'm not worthy. And just feeling really damaged and broken. It was such a contrast from the first few years of my life.
I understand. I think I related a little bit. So when you got to 14, as far as smoking weed and drinking, was this just something that was like some friends were doing it? Like what was that like? Why did you even go in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, friends just offered it to me. And the moment I experienced it, I was like,
this is good.
This is good. Yeah. I felt like that little kid again, like being free, being open. It wasn't like, sometimes people will say, well, I felt better looking or taller, or, you know. I just remember just feeling
good.
like relief. It wasn't so much that it changed the experience of not feeling good enough or not feeling lovable. It just didn't matter, or it mattered less. And of course, we know that I then chased that for many, many years. And the next 7 years until I got sober were just this search for something outside of myself to try to assuage or fix something that felt broken within.
So I know you told me that you got sober right before you turned 21, right?
Yes.
But in that time period between 14 and 21, did you finish school on time? Were you good in school? Were you paying attention, or were you checked out?
Yes, no, no, no. No, yes, no, no, yes.
Yeah.
So I did finish school on time. I did okay in school. As a matter of fact, I would either get 100s or low C's, depending on the subject, right? So there were things I was super engaged in and I excelled. But other than that, I struggled. And most of that, looking back, because I remember, especially in high school, kind of running with the super smart crowd and the very high achieving crowd. And I remember thinking, why are these guys my friend?
Right.
Like there was this sense that I wasn't good enough. That always has been such a big part of my story, or a theme for me. So I did not do well in school, but I did finish school, and there were certain subjects that I really excelled in.
Okay. Did your using of substances change?
Yes.
Into what?
Well, I mean, how many times have we heard it started as fun, and then it was fun with problems, and then it was problems? I'm going to say it a little bit differently. It was fun. It alleviated the problems.
Okay.
And then there was a point that it really didn't. So, of course, my solution was I should do more.
Right.
Graduated from high school and moved to Dallas. And Dallas was an interesting experience. It was far more cosmopolitan than Indiana, where I grew up. So it was really nice to be around different cultures. And I felt really kind of alive again.
Yeah.
And then at the last year of my using, I discovered ecstasy, literally in the birthplace of ecstasy at this club called the Start Club in Dallas. A therapist brought ecstasy to that club in like 1984.
A therapist,
because it was used only therapeutically.
Yes,
before.
it was.
You're nodding like you know a lot about
this.
Well,
I loved ecstasy. I did it pretty much the entire 90s.
Yeah, what's not to love?
Like every week. I mean, it truly is like one of the most blissful drugs out there.
Yeah.
It was ultimate euphoria. Like it just.
That's right.
It made me want to hug the entire world. Anybody around me, just love on them. I understand that. So, and when you say that they were using it in a therapeutic environment, but later on, I believe the FDA stepped in and said, we've got to make this a scheduled drug. Like we can't just have it out there.
I can tell you the date, June 1st, 1985.
Oh, wow.
July 1st, 1985.
Okay.
It's the day it became illegal, and like all the media was at this club because it was literally, you could buy it at the bar at that point.
Wow.
Because this is before it hit the West Coast. It started there. It's kind of strange that it started in that one club, but it did. And the night it became illegal, we were all there with hands full, with the press, like, look, Mom, it's 11:50, it's still legal, and then hiding it all by midnight. So, that 1 year was just 1 year of using that. And like you said, it was this beautiful, blissful experience.
Yes. But
obviously it didn't keep working that way for me.
I want to get into that.
Yeah.
But I did see it hit the West Coast. You're right, because I was here in LA, 88, 89.
Right.
We started having these underground nightclubs and clubs where people would break into warehouses, and then you'd have, during that time it was house music, a different type of house music, like pre-EDM. But definitely, like when it hit the scene and we were getting our hands on that, I was like, wow, this is better than the meth. This is better than the cocaine. This is better than the alcohol. This is everything I've always looked for. So tell me, like, as just doing it in that 1 year, obviously you were 20 years old, 19 years old, right?
Yeah.
What happened? Did it become a problem?
It's not so much that it became a problem. It's just that it wasn't really fixing what seemed to be broken within me.
Okay.
Right? So as you've described it, it's this beautiful, blissful experience. It really was the thing I was looking for.
Yes.
It took away all those inhibitions. It really numbed out that sense of brokenness. I was able to connect with people.
Yes.
As you said, just everything was love. And that was a really beautiful experience.
Sure.
So I can imagine if a person doesn't have an addictive tendency, it could be a wonderful thing to do periodically.
Here and there.
But,
For the normie.
I did it on I know exactly, because it was my roommate's birthday. It was 1 week later, 1 year to the date that I got sober, June 8th,
Oh, wow.
1985. I used it for the first time.
Mm.
And then, of course, the next day. And then the next Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And that was the entire year, every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. No sleeping, no eating, no going to work. It became pretty dark.
And for those that know what ecstasy can do, all the, with all good things that make you feel good, whether it's eating, dessert, or whatever, there's always going to be some kind of backlash. There's always going to be some kind of negative that comes from that. With ecstasy, for those that know, they know that the come down is at times really hard on you. I mean, it can suck the life out of you almost to the point where I used to experience suicidal ideation on certain days of coming down, which the only way I was going to be able to get out of this was just to do more. Were you experiencing that?
Absolutely. Every Sunday, as a matter of fact.
Sundays was the day usually.
Yeah. And it was probably a year into my recovery when I started recognizing that I would feel really sad or depressed on Sundays and not know why. It was like almost like part of my makeup. It became almost part of my DNA because it was every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday night, and literally no sleeping or eating.
Right.
Just doing lots of ecstasy and feeling really empty. And so, like, the depression, yes, the come down in some ways caused the depression, but I think it's also important to identify that it was that there were all these underlying issues that had not been addressed, and the drug was helping with that or masking that for those 3 days. But then the come down along with the unresolved issues did create a sense of feeling very empty and often suicidal on Sunday evenings.
Yep. And that's what it'll do to you. I mean, it depletes the serotonin within, the brain. So it's like it just sucks the life out of you. That's exactly how I felt. And I did it for a long time. I would do it the entire 90s. We were going to lots of raves out here in California. It was like a regular thing. I was even convinced myself, maybe after this weekend, we're not going to do that anymore. But the next thing you know, we get to Thursday, and Thursday's like Friday Junior. And then it was on and popping from Thursday to Friday to Saturdays. Sunday was the come down day. Monday was like usually for me the day of contemplation, like, do I even want to live anymore? Like, I hate myself.
Correct.
And then it was right back to doing it again. So, and then outside of that, were you into cocaine, meth, anything like that, heroin?
Not really.
You didn't really get into that
it was
stuff?
really, once I discovered ecstasy, that
It was
it.
everything.
Of course, I tried other things during that 1 year, cocaine, some different things, but that was really the one thing that grabbed me.
Okay. So would it be fair to say that ecstasy, that addiction brought you to your knees to where you wanted to change your life?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what it did for me, and I'm using that language consciously, is it allowed me to understand that there was a sense of emptiness within me. And I think sometimes in recovery circles, we say things like, you have to hit bottom in order to get sober. I would love us to change that narrative because that kind of implies that we have to lose everything. And the truth is, I've seen people lose everything and not get sober. And I've seen some other people that don't, quote unquote, need to do that. But what I have discovered is that the commonality that I hear with people is they reach this place that I would call, or some would call, spiritual bankruptcy or spiritual emptiness. When we're at that place, that's what happened for me.
That's actually what I believe in the most, especially, you talked about the bottoms. We hear about these rock bottoms and things, but there were some good old timers when I was a newcomer that said, every bottom has a trap door. Don't you think all those times that you got locked up or that you were homeless, those aren't viewed as bottoms? I said, yeah. They said, well, don't you think if that was your bottom and that's what's going to make you change, like you wouldn't keep going back and doing that insane behavior? So I've had a lot of bottoms. Nothing that's going to make me or nothing that actually made me have that shift in perception to want to completely quit living that lifestyle, except for the spiritual bottom.
Yeah.
That was it. Like, that was like where I was just tired of my own shit. Like, I didn't know how to live anymore. I don't know how to live in the world, and I don't feel good about myself, and I'm tired of living this lifestyle. So I got to make a decision. So you made a decision. Did you go to rehab?
I did not go to rehab. A friend of mine had gotten sober.
In Dallas?
In Dallas. And it's funny because I play it back now. I remember running into him on Halloween of 1985, right? So it took me a while from that point until I got sober. but there was a seed planted. And the interesting thing is he and I are still friends, and his sobriety date is October 21st. So he was 10 days sober, but 10 days sober to me seemed unfathomable.
Yeah.
Like, that did not seem like
That many
something I
days?
could
Yeah.
do. Well, because that's 2 weekends, right?
yeah.
And I mean, I had tried. I was in therapy on Wednesdays. You were talking about the pattern.
Yeah.
Mondays was the day of feeling like I can't go on. Tuesdays was, sort of sewing everything back up. And then on Wednesday, I'd be in therapy. And Wednesday mornings, I remember.
Yeah.
And this weekend was going to be different, right? And so when we're talking about a spiritual bottom for someone who's watching or listening,
Yeah.
that might mean different things to different people. For me, it was reaching this place of emptiness where what is the point of going on? It's almost like, am I going to stay on the planet? And if so, what am I going to need to do? And this sense of brokenness with my umbilical cord in my hand, trying to plug in and get fed from the outside,
Yes.
was no longer working. And we hear this where someone will say the pain of changing, the pain of staying stuck in the pattern becomes greater than the pain of changing.
Right.
And I actually, in my experience, we really don't change based on what we don't want.
Yeah.
We change based on what we do want.
Okay.
So if we have this place where like, I can't do this anymore, I literally don't know how to live.
Right.
And then something enters our consciousness. And in my case, it was my friend David who said, hey, if you ever want to I go to these groups. He didn't tell me what it was. I go to these groups, and if you ever want to, you're invited. And truthfully, I thought he was asking me out on a date. That's how twisted I was. And there's a whole other story there. He was definitely not asking me on a date. But 6 months later, in June, I was ready, and I ran into him, and I said, hey, can I go to one of those groups or meetings with you, right?
Okay.
And that's where it began for me.
So how long into the time that you decided that you were going to not use substances anymore did you decide you're here to stay, and you were convinced I can't go back and do anything anymore?
From the moment I walked into my first group, I stayed sober. I have stayed sober the whole time.
You weren't even 21?
I wasn't 21. I was almost 21. But I will say that year that we just talked about, overdosing, and there's a lot that
You overdosed?
Yeah.
On ecstasy?
On ecstasy and acid. I mean, it was pretty rough,
Right,
actually.
right.
Convulsions.
Did you ever try GHB back then?
I don't think it existed yet.
Okay, good. I mean, that was like liquid ecstasy. That was another animal. You can overdose on that for sure. But so you overdosed.
Yeah, but I mean, that didn't actually, and that's why this conversation of like hitting bottom.
Yeah.
I mean, I literally was writing my goodbye letter. I wrote a goodbye letter because I thought I was dying, but of course didn't tell anyone I was overdosing or call 911 or anything. Somehow I lived through that. But then that still wasn't quite enough, right? That still wasn't the pivotal moment. But so when I say, well, I never relapsed, I did plenty of that in that year, trying to stop, going to therapy, trying to get new friends, trying to not go to the club, whatever it was. So like by the time I think I walked into recovery, I just felt like I was ready to surrender. And there was a light and there was an energy there that was what I had been looking for.
In the group.
In the group.
People talked a certain way and it was attractive.
Yeah.
That's so awesome, especially being that young, because there's a lot of people that come and dip their toes in the water to see like, oh, what are these people doing over here? And maybe they come for a couple of days or weeks or months, but like not a lot come to stay.
Yeah.
So for you to do it that young and like make that absolute decision to stay, that's remarkable. Now, during that time in early recovery, did you remain in Dallas for a long time, or I know you ended up coming out to LA?
Yeah, I moved to Laguna Beach in '88.
Okay.
And I stayed here for like this area, in Southern California for like 14 months, back to Dallas for a couple of years. And then in 1991, I moved to San Francisco, where I was for 30 years.
Okay.
Yeah, until a little over 3 years ago, back to Southern California.
Okay. And now you're LA.
Now I'm in LA, in West Hollywood, yeah.
And so let me ask you this question. You obviously finished high school. Did you go to college?
I sure did not. And I didn't go back to school until I was 40. And it's a big part of my story, actually. I was 20 years sober, 40 years old, and I had a successful business. I also had a lot of debt.
What was the business?
It was a furniture store in San Francisco. And there are a lot of layers to that. We could do a whole show about that.
Yes.
But what I will say is I had really lost contact or kind of deviated from my spiritual path because when I got sober, the whole, like from 1986 until 1995, that first decade of sobriety was just a spiritual quest. Going to India, going to Thailand, doing meditation, doing chanting, like just really experiencing a lot of different kinds of spiritualities, definitely seeking. And then when I hit 30 years old, I kind of shifted back to like, oh, I want to be really successful. I want to grow up. I want to, so I got the house, I got the car, I got the partner and the business. And
this is all in San Francisco?
All in San Francisco.
Yes.
Yeah. And around the age of 40, I had this knowing that I wanted to do something with spirituality, become some kind of spiritual teacher. I know it had been somewhere deep within me for many, many years, but it was something that I finally said yes to and put voice to. So I went back to school at that point.
And what did you study?
I studied spirituality, spiritual leadership at Unity Institute. Did that for 5 years.
Where's that, in San Francisco?
No, actually, it's in the Midwest, but a lot of it was like long distance learning. And
did you go there, or was it online?
A lot of it was online, but a lot of it was also just in different spiritual communities throughout the country. And then I did some of it it's outside of Kansas City.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So did you get a degree?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's not officially a degree.
Right.
It actually is an ordination.
Okay.
But I don't like using that word a lot because it means a lot to a lot of people. It means something, but ultimately it was like a 5-year program I went through and graduated from that. And then I started an independent New Thought Center. Simultaneously, I started working in the field of behavioral health and addiction treatment. And then became ordained in New Thought, and then ultimately affiliated with Agape, Michael Beckwith. And
I love Agape.
Me too.
I love it. Yeah. I love Michael Beckwith.
Me too. He's an amazing human.
Yes, he is. So behavioral health, how did you get into that area? And when you did you bring your whole spiritual teachings implemented into that type of work?
Yes, that's exactly what happened. While I was going to school and I had started this independent New Thought Center, my friend started working at a program called Altamira up in the Bay Area in Sausalito. And as soon as he told me about it, I just felt very deeply I was supposed to work there. And I thought, this is interesting because I kind of promised myself I will never work in the recovery field.
Right.
But I just felt it very deeply. And as a matter of fact, when I applied for the job, they responded with, "Thank you for applying, but you really don't have the experience we're looking for." And I responded with, "That's really weird because I know I'm supposed to be there."
Oh.
And my now friend called me and she's like, "I need to at least meet you." So I went in for an interview. It went really well. And then it turns out my friend Drew was the CEO and he's like, "Hire this guy." And so,
what was your position? Like group facilitator?
It was, well, it started as residential counselor, right? But very quickly, to answer your question, very quickly, I realized I wanted to bring what I was working with in my own journey of spirituality, and also having just graduated or in the process of finishing up school, I wanted to bring a different message to the recovery field. And I was just really blessed with people who saw that and really honored that.
Yeah.
And the rest is history, I guess. That was 2008 when I started working in the field.
Okay, I got sober in 2007. And I know last time that I had you on the podcast, I spoke to you about one of the things that captured my heart was when we would, in the rehab I was in on Mondays, they would have this educational group. Sometimes it was super boring because they'd tell you about the frontal cortex of your brain and all that stuff. But every once in a while they'd put on The Secret, and that's where I ever first caught wind of Michael Beckwith. And they called them spiritual practitioners on the Secret. Yeah. And so later on throughout my journey of recovery, magical things would happen. I went to a Prince concert, and one time he brought Michael Beckwith up on stage, and this lady that happened to be a Prince fan next to me said, "Oh, that's the guy from my church." I'm like, "What church?" She said, "Agape." I'm like, "What's that?" She goes, I go, "That guy looks familiar." She goes, "That's Michael Beckwith from The Secret." I'm like, "The Secret? Oh, yeah, I remember him." And so then I had a friend who she was a member of Agape, and she would take me there.
Amazing.
And when I would walk in, I was like, this is different. I mean, it's got a church vibe, but it's different. they're very open to anybody.
Yeah.
And then when he would come in, and he was just a powerhouse. I was like, oh my God. And then I got his book, Life Visioning. And when I read that, I realized like, wow, this guy's got some history. Like obviously I think he was a pastor before, was studying to become one, but later on created this movement. So are you considered a practitioner? Like, have you been involved in any of that there at Agape?
Yeah. So the story with Agape is really interesting. I had started the Independent New Thought Center and was ordained there, and then was working at Altamira and fell in love with it. And I was really doing both of these things. And we moved our center from San Francisco to the East Bay in Oakland. And I was working with my good friend Joan Stedman, who knew Michael pretty well. She was one of the people who helped him start Agape in 1986.
Yes.
And so we were doing visioning. So you mentioned life visioning, right? So we were doing visioning as a community. And if someone doesn't know what that is, I highly recommend getting Michael's book. My new book, I actually, part of it, there's a whole chapter about visioning, and I, of course, dedicate it and honor Michael and his teachings. But we were visioning, and I kept getting these images of Michael, and I started having dreams. I had a dream he pulled up in this red sports car and said, "Get in, we're going on a ride." I hadn't ever met him.
You hadn't even met him yet?
At that point, I hadn't met him. And another
Isn't that crazy that you're probably reading like the way he wrote and this character of him built in your head?
I never read him.
Oh, you never read his stuff?
I never heard him talk.
So this guy showed up in your dreams before you ever actually met him?
Exactly.
Was it the same black guy, Mike?
Oh, no, it's Michael Beckwith.
It was him.
Of course I knew who he was.
Oh, you'd seen his stuff.
I've seen The Secret, but I'd never heard him speak. And going back, it's really interesting. The first time I ever spoke at a New Thought Center, don't remember what year, maybe 2004, I gave a talk called Beyond Metaphysics. And someone came up to me at the end and said, "Do you know who Michael Beckwith is? You're talking almost exactly the way he is." And later,
but you hadn't met him.
I hadn't met him. Hadn't read anything yet of his. And in my first book, Conscious Being, I write about these 4 levels of consciousness.
Yes.
Almost identical to what Michael does.
It's like spirit recognized spirit.
Yeah.
Without even talking.
So what happened is really cool. So I would get these visions and just sit with that. And I was telling my friend Joan, like, I'm getting these visions.
Yeah.
And we would sit with it. And he ended up calling her and said, "I caught in a vision that your community," meaning the one that I had started, "should be the first satellite of Agape."
Oh my God.
And I hadn't even met him yet, right? And so it became Agape Bay Area. Michael came to the Bay Area. And, then of course, one of the things that I love, we're out in the world, we meet a lot of people, right? People who are spiritual teachers. And, they're not always quite the same when the camera's not on. Michael is the real deal. Like, going to lunch with him, hanging out with him, walking around with him, that consciousness is a very authentic thing.
Love it.
So being affiliated then and then became ordained through Agape and stayed as the spiritual director of that community for 2 years. And then ultimately discernment led me to wanting to be conscious recovery full-time.
Okay, so then what year was Conscious Recovery? And for those that don't know, Conscious Recovery is your organization?
It is. I mean, it was my second book. That's what it started as. So having started working in the field in 2008, the things that stood out to me most that I was very curious about was how many times people were coming back to treatment and how we continue to just treat symptoms and behaviors, right? And then wondering why they're back. And then the other piece, maybe even more important to me, was hearing the way well-meaning clinicians, counselors, coaches, therapists were talking about their clients as if they were broken. Something's wrong here and we need to help fix them.
Yes.
And coming in with this spiritual lens, I was like, what might get created if we were to look for the wholeness within them and realize that they have the capacity to heal?
So not viewing them as broken in the beginning.
Not at all.
Looking at what's actually not broken.
Yes.
I love it.
And then what gets created when we look at them through the lens of their infinite potential to heal instead of what's broken. And that, I developed these groups over the years and the clients loved them and remarkable results. And so it's interesting, it's all around the same time. 2016 was when we became affiliated with Agape. I was working at Foundation San Francisco at the time, doing groups, and I had been doing, I was doing that for many years. And the idea of conscious recovery, the book came up, and
Right.
I didn't want to write it.
Why?
I didn't want to write it because I didn't want to be pigeonholed as a recovery guy. And, in intuition, inner wisdom.
Is that the first book?
That's the second book.
Second book.
Yeah.
What was the first one called?
Conscious Being.
Okay. And then the second one's this?
Conscious Recovery. Yeah. And
Okay.
in 2017, 2017 it was published. So around 2015, 2016, I finally said, yes, I'm going to write this book. And then
So you got over your hang up of calling it recovery because you didn't want to be a recovery guy? Why?
Because I think the way people view it, what that means to people, sort of like the paradigm as it's established, I don't always really, necessarily vibrate with the same frequency of what we think of as addiction and how it's looked down upon. And, there are many layers.
Then that must mean that you probably respect Gabor Maté.
I absolutely do.
Because he has a whole different outlook on it.
Yeah.
And I love it.
Yeah. I
have a conversation with a friend of mine. He has this, he's got a podcast called A Broader Lens. He actually had Gabor Mate's son on there, and he's bringing on Marianne Williamson too.
Nice.
He loves to bring, he's well read, and he didn't used to know how to read. So when he got sober, he brings all of his heroes on. He gets all the authors and everything. So he often says, like, even in Alcoholics Anonymous literature, he says that's outdated. That was the Dr. Silkworth was from that time. Right. They should have Gabor Maté be, or somebody along those lines. We're in a different era and a different age. We have to view addiction and alcoholism from a different scope. It isn't what it was in 1939 anymore.
Well, and when AA started, it shifted from being there's something fundamentally morally deficient about this person to it's a disease.
Right.
That was groundbreaking in 1935.
Absolutely.
Right? That was absolutely a huge step forward. And then, for those of us who know the literature, it says we realize we know only a little.
Only a little.
Right. So there's more and
you remember
more.
something? Bill Wilson wrote that book at 3 years sober.
Right.
So it can't be the end all be all, because if you got a newcomer or somebody nowadays that got sober and within 3 years he wants to define his interpretation of alcoholism based off of what he thinks, how do we know if he's totally that was a very humbling statement for them to say, we realize we only know a little.
That's right. And I think they legitimately meant that.
Yeah.
Right. So
because they probably really didn't know it all.
Right. Right. And to see it as a disease was groundbreaking at the time. And now we're realizing, and as they did as well, that it's a spiritual malady and that it is something much deeper and that it really is a response to pain. And so with conscious recovery, I identify the 3 root causes of addiction as unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame.
Wow.
And being able to actually heal that would it be a disease? I would rather steer away from the controversy and say, I think it's this and that.
Sure.
Right. There's physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual aspects to all of life, including addiction. So is there a genetic predisposition? Quite possibly. But right now is an exciting time to be alive because science is now studying what the mystics have been saying, the likes of Michael Beckwith have been saying for a long time, which is we actually can change our bodies. We can change our DNA. We can change, if it's even true that, that we once believed not long ago that mental illness, which I don't use the word, but that's what they would use, was a chemical imbalance. Now they're saying, oh, maybe that's not what it is.
A lot of people are misdiagnosed and they're all medicated and everything. And then my friends over here at Story Wellness, they changed the name of their company to Story Wellness, and they specialize in narrative therapy. In other words, to break the narrative. And sometimes people were misdiagnosed, so they get them off of certain medications because perhaps they're overly medicated for something that somebody decided to medicate them for.
Yeah, and listen, there is nothing fundamentally wrong with medication, but there are certainly people who were diagnosed with things and medicated that don't necessarily need it. So how do we start to balance all that, right? And to me, I'm always this and that, not this or that, right? So yes, there are physical components. Yes, there are intellectual components.
Yes.
Most treatment, as we know it, lives in those two, maybe a little bit of the emotional, right? So they look at the disease model and the thoughts, the mental, what they would call mental illness. They might get into emotions, but the spiritual piece has been lacking. And, in 12-step, they say, yes, it's a spiritual program. But what I'm talking about isn't necessarily looking for a higher power. It's remembering that perfection that's within you.
Within. And that brings me back to what you were saying a second ago, as far as mystics.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that every single human being is actually a mystic, and what I believe each one has the ability and capability of doing is to tap into that oneness within themselves and really find the love within and be able to express that out into the world?
You know my answer to that.
Please tell it to me.
Well, of course. Of course we're all mystics, right?
We're all mystics.
We come in as a spark of divinity.
Yes.
Not as a broken human being.
Right.
So if it's true.
There's just so many damn layers of ego that holds us back from actually tapping into our mystical qualities, our realness, our oneness.
Yeah. And so for anyone who's watching or listening, if that sounds esoteric, it's actually profoundly simple. The foundational principle of conscious recovery is underneath all addictive behavior is an essential self that is whole and perfect.
Okay.
So we come in as a whole and perfect spiritual being, and then we get programmed by the world, usually by unconscious people, not deliberately trying to harm us. There is some of that, but for the most part, the generational trauma is passed down.
Sort of like what Don Miguel Ruiz says in his 4 Agreements. It's the judge and the critic. And where does it even come from? It comes from our upbringing. It comes from our environment. It comes from the people that we look up to or the people that we don't want to look up to, but everything, we're programmed.
Yep.
It's
and we
just
absorb
programmed.
it. Yeah. And I love the term he uses, Don Miguel Ruiz, the domestication of the human.
That's right.
We get domesticated.
The parasite.
Oh, the parasite.
He says the parasite, like also that each person has a parasite. So your story is your story, mine's mine. But if I hang out with you too much and get involved in your story can become mine. And in AA, they call it a disease, or in NA, they call it a disease. So parasite, disease, evil, whatever we want to name it, it is the stuff that lurks within that holds us back from actually really tapping into our essence.
That's right. So recovery for me starts with creating a safe enough space. And that often means external, but even more important, or in addition to that, is the internal safety, so that we can start to unlearn all of the stuff that we've picked up along the way that's counter to the truth of who and what we are. And as we tap into or reconnect with, which we never really disconnected from, but we become aware that who we are is actually an unharmed and unharmable spiritual being. And if that is the starting point for recovery, that changes everything, because then we can heal the trauma. Then we can look at how we've disconnected from our true nature. We can look at the shame or the belief in our brokenness. We can actually heal that. And that's, to me, extremely exciting.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, it's pretty deep. And some people, there are some that would hear this and be like, what are they talking about? But really, they have the ability to learn it. I mean, truly. So let me ask you this question. You wrote this book, and then I know you've written some other books. And when you started Conscious Recovery, the point was to go into these centers and try to help their clinicians have a different language or a different thought process, or even the clients within themselves. Is that what you're doing now?
Yeah, and it's changing. It's been 7 years I've been doing conscious recovery, and I've recently started shifting some things. For the last 7 years, my primary focus has been going into treatment programs, training them on the model, but more important than that, helping clinicians re-access their true nature, heal their own trauma, their own disconnection, their own shame, so that they can be more present with their clients, start to view them through the lens of what is whole and perfect about them.
Not bring the transference and the counter-transference into the relationships.
All the judgments that we all hold.
So it's changing, you say?
Yeah, and then along with that, there's always been books, workbooks, and curriculum, group curriculum.
Yeah.
My shift recently has been going more directly both to the clinicians, doing regional trainings, supporting clinicians in accessing their inner wisdom, reinvigorating passion for their work, doing their own healing, but also as much directly to the clients as possible, because what I have experienced, so many people will read Conscious Recovery and say, oh, I wish I would have had this in the beginning. Someone who's 2 years sober or 5 years sober, and they read it and they say, what would it have been like for me to have this on day one? So that's really my passion now, is how to let people know that there's a different possibility, that I'm broken and I'm damaged and I'm going to have this lifelong chronic illness. a different perspective in addition to whatever support they're getting to help them realize they're highly capable beings and that they do have the power within them to heal.
Oh, I love it. So, curious, where the hell did you get the motivation and the energy to be able to put all this together, the workbooks and the trainings? Like how do you do it?
Well, I will tell you.
I mean, you just said you didn't go to college until like you were 40, right?
Yeah.
And even there you were going to become a spiritual teacher. You're so well-spoken. You seem so educated. And you've got to have a lot of drive to be able to write a book, let alone a few books.
Well, I can answer that in so many different ways, but I'll answer it in this way. The deeper truth is, when I was 18 months sober, I was suicidal. And the paradigm at the time sounded something like this, and I'm going to guess you've heard this exact thing said. Don't worry about anything but not drinking. Your life is a miracle. Now go help someone else.
That's right.
And I thought, yeah, that's been a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
But I want to die.
Right.
And I met this woman. Her name is Marianne Williamson. She passed away in 1998. She changed my life. She took me on a journey of an inner exploration, of a deep healing. And because I had that experience based on how she saw me, how she saw me she saw me as a whole and perfect being when I could not see anything but broken, damaged, messed up human. That gives me the energy. Her last words when she died were, someone needs to cancel my hair appointment. But soon before those were her last words, which I think are brilliant. But maybe 6 months before she passed away, she said to me, you are very extroverted. You're going to take this message into a much bigger arena than I have been able to.
Right.
And it was almost as if she was saying to me, go do this. And so that has given me the energy.
Right. She lit the fire under you.
She lit the fire. And the truth is, when I'm connected, when I'm aware of my true nature, there's infinite energy, right? Infinite energy to do everything that is required to write my 3 books, to 10 workbooks, curriculum, trainings. I feel very energized by it.
I love it. I think it's great. So you have a new book coming out? We won't talk about that. How about
we don't have. We can talk about. I will at one point write a book that's more like an autobiography. I already have the name. I just don't want to write it. That's how I am, though. I'm like, I don't want to do that. It's my ego or whatever. But Spirit will continue to say, write it, and eventually I will. But my 3rd book, Conscious Creation, came out in 21.
Okay.
And I honored Michael Beckwith, wrote the foreword to that, and I honor him as part of.
And when
the
did
process.
this one come out?
2017.
This was 2017. Nice. Okay, so it's Conscious Recovery, a fresh perspective on addiction by TJ Woodward, the author of the best-selling book, Conscious Being. So this is the book.
That's the book.
You guys can get it. There's TJ on the back of it. This has been excellent having you here today in person, doing this. Loving every minute of it, holding on to every word because it's very powerful, the way that you speak and I know you're from the heart, and I love that about you.
Thank you.
Always have. I know we have a lot of things to talk about in the future, things that, we might be able to do some work together. If there's any kind of energy that you can put out into the universe for anybody that might be struggling or might think that they're broken, what would you like to say to the people before we sign off?
Quite often, people will ask me this, and I close with a very similar thing. So I'm going to do that again. And that is, if no one has told you today, you are a whole and perfect being. So regardless of what you've done, regardless of what has happened to you and for you, there is a place within you that is unharmed and unharmable. That is the truth of who and what you are. And you do have access to that. In this moment, I want you to know not only that you are loved, but you are the source energy. You are love itself. And knowing that will change everything. My invitation for you is to take a look at everything you've ever believed that's counter to that truth. Question that, return to this deep knowing of who and what you truly are, and watch the miracles happen.
Awesome. So thank you so much for coming to the corner. Thank you for interacting with me and just talking today. It's very good to see you. And until we meet again, this has been another episode of Pej's Recovery Corner, Recovery Podcast. If you find us on YouTube, it is under my Pej Interventions YouTube page. Please subscribe, please like, please share everywhere. We want to get this message of recovery out to the entire world as much as we can, one day at a time. Love you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Peace.